Hi, everyone. So my name is Alexis Menard, and today I'll be talking about how you can adapt your web experience, your website, to a new class of devices. So what do I mean by new class of devices, right? New classes of devices. So I'm talking about foldables and dual screens. So foldable characteristics, I mean, you've seen them for at least 2 years now. Basically, it's a device where the screen can fold itself, bringing you more screen states in a smaller form factor, right? Smaller form factor. Right? Like I put a little animation to basically showcase the example. Dual screen, it's basically two, I would say, regular screen, physical screen that are tied together through a hinge. So it's different than the foldable in the sense that the screens are just the typical touch screen that you know, like with glass, right? So hard, basically, versus the foldables, the screen itself fold, right? We also call them multiple internal display at Intel. Dual screen is mostly a marketing term that's being pushed by Microsoft with their Surface Duo product. But we believe at Intel that there would be more, there would be devices with more than two screens, so we call them multiple internal displays. So they are available today. You can buy them. You can buy the Surface Duo. There is the Galaxy Z Fold from Samsung. There's also a couple of one foldable PC from Lenovo, and then there is also a dual screen laptop from Asus as well. So it's shipping today. So you can play with this device already, right? It's not something coming down the road. But why? So why we create, like, why Samsung, Intel, Lenovo, and Microsoft are pushing these new devices? Well, they have interesting inherent properties. Like, you can use them in different ways. And for example, this foldable PC that I was talking about, you can use them as a laptop by having a keyboard and, you know, just a normal, normal notebook posture. And then you can detach the keyboard and, you know, revealing the bottom part of the screen, and, you know, have more screen states, have a split view if you want to. Or you can use the built-in kickstand and then put it up on your desk and use it as a monitor. So when it's fully open, the device is like at least, I think it's 11-inch diagonal. So it's a mini monitor, but when you fold it half, it, you know, it takes half the size, which is pretty neat. So you can also think about cases where you could do split screen, you could do put video controls or like gamepad controls on the bottom part of the screen, or, you know, have those tent mode where, you know, half of the screen is light up and the other one doesn't do anything, so you can watch a video. So basically, you're using them differently depending on what you want to do, and we call them the mode in which you're using them, we call them posture. So there is a tablet posture, a tent posture, or laptop posture, or book posture, and then a tabletop posture, basically. And what's the main difference between these devices? Like, if you want to target them, so a dual screen have a hinge, a physical hinge, and it separates the content, right? It also has a shutter fold. And the hinge of a dual screen or multiple internal display device can move up to 360 degrees. So you can fully open it in half, basically, and fully close it. A foldable OLED screen do not have a physical hinge. There is a seam in the middle. It's a less acute fold. And at this time, with the current tech, the hinge only move 180 degrees, right? So you can open it flat and close it, basically. You cannot fully rotate it around. And the interest and why it matters for the web is because you're using them differently and they have different posture. You can also enable UX patterns weren't possible before or weren't relevant before. And Samsung actually showcased good example where you half fold the Galaxy Z Flip, then the UI reacts accordingly for the camera, and the top part becomes the viewfinder, and the bottom part becomes the part with the controls. So it's a very good selfie device at this point. And Google also took advantage of the form factor with Duo, where the video feed is shown on half of the screen, and then the controls are on the bottom part, or the chat, for example. So which means that you have the video feed right in front of you, which is pretty cool. One of the new UX pattern as well, pushed by multiple internal displays or dual screen, is when you basically maximize the application across the two screens. In this case, we call that spanning. We span across the two screen, and you can react to that. And in this case, Microsoft showcased a demo of Outlook in which the left side is the regular, scroll view of your emails, and the right side is the current conversation you're selecting. So it's a pretty neat way to use the entire real estate. However, it brings UX challenges for the developers, for website developers, as well as the browser, right, as Chrome or Edge or any Chromium-based browser. So here's an example of Word on the web, and on the upper left corner, that's just fine, full screen. Then you on the right side, in the middle, top middle, then you render it on the middle screen, on the dual screen device, and then the hinge comes in the middle, and then suddenly the flow is broken, right? Like you could see that it makes reading hard, right? Like you have something right in the middle. So if you wanted to enable and enlight your existing app, then you would reflow your content according to the screen state, right? It's not too much of an issue in landscape in portrait mode, because the break feels more natural, like from what we've seen on, when you use your computer. So, but at least in landscape, it becomes an issue. And then you can expand that to video controls as well, right? Typical video controls, the play button is in the middle of the screen. On a dual screen, it's going to be a problem. Actually, I keep saying dual screen, but on a foldable, it's also a problem, especially if the device is half folded or not fully open, because there is a seam, and in that seam, even though it's visible, it's not the easiest part for the user to interact with. Like it's a weird spot for a finger to touch, right? And even on a foldable, you would like to move your video control into a place where it's easier to interact with. And in this case, in landscape, you would want to move them on some sides, and then in portrait, it's even in portrait mode, it's even worse, because then the video becomes cut in half. And even on the foldable, then you would want, the moment you start folding it, then you want to adapt the video feed and put it somewhere else, right? If you take a small application that I wrote, which is a simple typical gallery, where you just scroll down, then we span it across the two screens, then suddenly images are cut. You open, we assume that it's, you full screen your photo when you click on it, and then it becomes right in the middle of the, on the hinge, and it's not that great. What we would like to do is maybe something like that, right? Well, I scroll on the left, and then on the right, I show the preview of the picture with maybe some legend and more details, right? So we clearly see that we need to enable developers. They need to know about the hinge, the fold. They need to know about how the device is being used, and so they can adapt their website accordingly. The community, which include Microsoft, Samsung, Intel, W3C, and Google, we're pushing for new APIs, new primitives for the web. One is the CSS spanning media feeder, then its counterpart, a JavaScript API called Windows Segment Enumeration, and then a device posture API, and then enhancement to the virtual keyboard. And I'll cover that after. So the CSS spanning media feature, it's pretty simple to use. If you're familiar with media queries and CSS, then it's just another responsive target. So you'll have to opt in with your website and your code, and then you can, provide a better experience on these devices. So even if you're spanning across the two screen on a dual screen, we're still in a case where we have one viewport, right? It's not two separate monitors with separate viewports and separate browser window running. So it's simple and familiar. So there is a few values if you single fold vertical, single fold horizontal, and you do not have for basically all the devices currently in the market, computers and desktop computers, mobile phone and everything. So you may ask, but we already have the orientation, and then we also have the ratio media feature. I could probably figure out that when the window is spanned across the two screens, for example, I could probably, with some black magic, figure out the aspect ratio is very weird. Therefore, I most likely are on a dual screen. Therefore, I can provide a different UI for it. And the reason is it's not enough. When you use the device in landscape, the content is in portrait on a dual screen, right? So and then on the Galaxy Z Folds, for example, which is now when you have it's half folded, for example, then it's in portrait and then everything's portrait. So, and then you may rotate the device, and then depending on the aspect ratio, depending on the form factor, then you may have different configuration, and you can't rely on only the orientation to figure it out. So how does the screen spanning media feature work? So let's say you have a body, you declare a background orange, then everything's orange. Then if you say I want to target, a small form factor, then I say my max width is 540 pixel, my background will be green, then this pseudo mobile phone will be green. And then you can do the same now. You can say, hey, if you're spanning and you're spanning vertically, and you're a mobile phone as well, like a tiny device like the Surface Duo, then please change your background to yellow. So you see, that's quite easy, very familiar. So we can studently enable like stuff I was talking about. You can, decide to split your UX, reflow your content, align your columns, and stuff like that. So of course you may ask, but that's not enough. For how do I align the columns, for example, across the hinge? And that's a good question. And I explain how we could do that. The other things you want to fix, for example, is typical dialogues. Dialogues shows up in the middle of the screen, typically middle vertical, middle horizontal, and that doesn't really work. So we need to be adjusted. So we could do something like that. And of course, as I was saying, if you want to align your column across the theme, then you need some environment variable for you to tell you where the actual hinge is. So that's fine. We provide you our values to help you design around that. So for example, we give you a fold left environment variable. So you can, snap to the left of the fold. Then we tell you the top as well, so you can snap according to that. And then also we tell you the width and the height of the hinge. So again, that's all you need to design around the hinge. The JavaScript Windows Segment Enumeration API, it's basically the same idea of the one I was talking previously, but just a JavaScript API rather than CSS, right? So you get a single entry point, which is get Windows segment. So in the case of a dual screen, when you're spanning, each screen is a segment. So in this case, if you're on a regular desktop, then you would say, hey, how many Windows segments do you have? And we tell you there is only one, and it's the segment number 0. And if you're on a dual screen, then you would have two segments, 0 and 1. And for each of the segments, we can give you, for example, the top, left, and width and height of them, right? So, and one thing that is inherent to a JavaScript API and due to JavaScript lifecycle are obviously anytime the Windows segment number may change, could be in two scenarios: when you're rotating the device or you're resizing the browser window. In this sense, you're spanning or unspanning, basically. And so in this case, you have to listen for orientation change and require the window segment to update your layout accordingly. So same thing for the resize function, especially when you're unspanning. So when you want to use the JavaScript API and not the CSS one, but basically anything that is not DOM target. So let's say you're doing a Canvas 2D app, a WebGL app, work with CSS Paint worklets, anything like that, then of course you need the JavaScript API. Any dynamic or unpredictable layout, then you calculate and update your layout at runtime. Those requires you need the JavaScript API basically. One of the things we're looking at on the Windows Segment Enumeration API is how we can make it, and especially the screen spanning feature or CSS, is how we can make it work in the case that there is more than one fold, so more than two screens. So we could be a bit more future-proof. So that's one of the things we're exploring. So expect the syntax to change a little bit. The next API that we're proposing is the device posture API. This one's pretty straightforward. The idea is that it's a very simple specification where you can query the current posture of the device. So it will just tell you the value of the current posture. And so the posture is usually mostly determined by the angle of the fold, so the hinge, or how much the device is open. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. But I put this diagram for you to understand roughly the modes and how roughly what's the angle in which each mode is activated. But in the case, it's a bit more complicated than that. For example, we can detect tabletop mode using the fact that there's a sensor on the kickstand on the back of the device. Also, there are other sensors that come into play, like do you have the keyboard on top of the screen or not, and those kind of things. So, but it's just for reference. So yeah, then you can use the two APIs I was talking about before. So if, for example, this little example, if the device posture is laptop, then and I'm spanning and I have a single fold, then I can split the UI of my application and do the split UX that I showed at the beginning of this presentation. The last API that we have is the virtual keyboard API. Which is due to legacy. So if you remember mobile web when it came along, then one of the problems that we had back then was what happened if the user focused on the text field where you need to input stuff with the virtual keyboard, and that text field is at the bottom of the screen. So the keyboard will pop up, and then it will occlude the text field. So that was kind of not cool. You will have the user have to scroll and so on. So one way we solved that back then, instead of asking every single website to update their code so that mobile phone could be supported and virtual keyboard could be supported, was that browser will typically scroll the content automatically for you. And that's great. But it's an issue on a dual screen, because imagine you're spanning across two screens, or even on a foldable device, you're spanning across two screens, you select the text, and then it's going to scroll the entire viewport, which means the left side will get weird. And that's an issue. So what we want to do is only scroll the right side, right? Again, Microsoft is proposing extensions to the virtual keyboard API in a way so that you can opt in again, and you can say, hey, you know what? I know how to relay out in case there's a virtual keyboard. Just tell me, and you set the bits to true, and then you get new events, and you can actually tell. You can actually do your own resizing. So here's a little example of an app where the keyboard shows on the left, and then on the right it scrolls. All right, but the left content did not scroll, the green content stay in place, which is good. And when you opt in, then you're going to get a new event that you can listen, and that event is overlaygeometrychange, and then you're going to get the position of the keyboard, so top, left, and width and height. It's important that it's the position, not just width and height, and because on these new classes of devices, then the keyboard is movable. So it can be anywhere on the screen. So it's important that you know not just the coordinates, like the entire coordinates of the keyboard. So at the end of the day, if you want to recap, then this is the current spec coverage. And at this point, there is not support for posture in dual screens or multiple internals. There is support for foldable being implemented in Chrome at this point. But at the end of the day, what we would see right now, that's the current status, but the APIs are complementary, and hopefully they'll be implemented in both variants of the devices, right? Microsoft is going to implement that into the Duo, for example, and then Intel, for example, on their dual screen foldable PC. So yeah. So what's the standout? So at this point, most of the APIs are shipping in a hedge. The reason is that the devices that are targeted so far is the Microsoft Surface Duo. So of course, Edge is the primary browser there. So it's working great for that. The device posture API is currently being implemented in Chrome. So for now, it's not enabled anywhere. And the virtual keyboard at this point is only an Edge stuff. We have some set of polyfills. You can play with the API right now and give us feedback for all the JavaScript and CSS. There is also this little widget that I wrote, which is a configurator that you can drop in your page. And then you can see, let's see, do you have time? Yes, I have time. Let's do that. Let's move it here. Oops, and let's put that full screen. So yeah, you can see, so let's see. So there's this little widget here, which can maximize like this. And then you could say, let's say I want to be on the Surface Duo, and then the page will react, and then you can try to see how it looks. Or if I want to see on the Galaxy Z, folks, you can see the seam is half translucent. You can also rotate, for example, see if how that would look like. So yeah, it's pretty cool. See, yeah, so that's the video in case the demo was working. I also created a little foldable battleship demo that looks very good on the device, so you can play with it if you're bored at the office. I wrote also about how I actually ported the demo and made it work on the dual screen. So how much effort it was for me. So yeah, please join the effort. All the stuff is happening in the device and sensor working group. Of course, the CSS part is happening on the CSS working group. And then we have all the second screen incubation group for some of the APIs. So yeah, please join and give us feedback. That's what we want. And thank you. And I open for question. Let me bring back the browser window. So I'm seeing Jeffrey commenting about the keyboard is fingerprinting. Yeah, maybe. The keyboard size may be different from device to device, but they're unique to a given device, right? So let's say you're buying a Lenovo X1 Fold, then the keyboard size will be the same for all Lenovo X1 Fold, but maybe not the same for, you know, I don't know, let's say Samsung comes up with a foldable device, right? So
my Android device has a customizable, like an option for how big the keyboard is.
Oh yeah.
There's like, I think 5 values, but we should be careful about that.
Yeah. Any other questions? It's great. My presentation was crystal clear. Well, with that said, I think anyway, it's time. So, and I don't want you to miss the other session. So I'll let everyone go. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email, and then I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you, everyone, for attending.